The wind whispered through the frost-kissed trees of rural Wyoming, carrying with it a biting chill that settled deep into the earth. It was early February, and winter still ruled the land with an iron fist, leaving snowdrifts scattered like alabaster waves across empty fields. A small, modest farmhouse stood alone against the stark landscape, a relic of simpler times. Inside, the fire crackled gently in the hearth, its embers painting the walls with a warm, flickering glow. Sitting in a faded armchair by the fire was Walter Grayson, a widower in his mid-70s. He was a quiet, contemplative man with silver hair that had long abandoned its war against age and deep-set eyes that held decades of untold stories. A retired mechanic, Walter had lived a life of hard work and modest living, carving out a peaceful existence far from the noise of the world. The only company he kept now was Rusty, his loyal, golden-furred Labrador retriever. Rusty was as much a fixture of the farmhouse as the walls themselves. For 6 faithful years, he'd been Walter's constant shadow, accompanying him through long winters and golden summers alike. Where Walter went, Rusty followed, whether it was to mend a creaky fence or sit quietly under the sunlit porch. The bond between them had been forged in the fires of loneliness after Walter lost his wife, Margaret, to cancer. Rusty had saved him from a silent, hollow grief, filling the house with soft barks and warm snuggles. But today, something weighed heavily on Walter's mind. As the snow piled higher outside, the old man stared down at an empty coffee table where his ledger notebook once sat, a worn-out thing with scribbles and numbers that most people wouldn't understand. Walter had, years ago, made an investment that seemed almost laughable at the time. Bitcoin. It had been his son, Mark, who'd convinced him to dip his toes into the world of cryptocurrency when it was worth just pennies. "Dad, one day this could be worth something," Mark had said with excitement in his voice during one of his rare visits. "Just keep it safe, all right?" Walter, trusting his son's enthusiasm, had bought a small sum, next to nothing compared to the wild investments of others. But over the years, Walter learned that his little gamble had turned into a small fortune. Mark's words rang true as Bitcoin skyrocketed in value. That money was never for luxuries. Walter planned to leave it for his son and his grandchildren, his way of making sure they'd never have to struggle the way he did. But now the notebook, and more importantly, the private key that gave him access to his digital wallet, was gone. He had noticed it missing 3 days ago. Since then, Walter had torn apart every room of the house in search of it. Drawers emptied, carpets lifted, shelves gutted. Each search ended in frustration and a hollow feeling in his chest that gnawed at him relentlessly. Walter wasn't an emotional man, but the thought of failing to leave this gift for his family was unbearable. Rusty had watched silently as Walter scoured the house, following him from room to room with his big, soulful eyes. The old dog didn't understand the significance of what was lost, but he understood his owner's distress. Each sigh, each muttered curse under Walter's breath, weighed on Rusty as though it were his own. On the 3rd day, as Walter slumped into his chair once more, exhausted and defeated, Rusty approached him. The dog nudged Walter's trembling hand with his wet nose, as if to say, "Don't give up just yet." Walter managed a small smile and scratched behind Rusty's ears. "It's gone, boy," he murmured, his voice gravely with age and despair. "I don't know what else to do." The snowstorm outside had worsened over the last few hours, howling against the windows as if to mock the old man's helplessness. As darkness fell over the Wyoming plains, Walter leaned back in his chair, shutting his eyes briefly. For the first time in years, tears escaped and traced a path down his weathered face. Rusty, sensing his owner's sorrow, let out a small sympathetic whine before curling up at his feet. It wasn't much, but the warmth of his dog's presence reminded Walter that he wasn't alone. The setting had been established. An old man with a broken heart and a missing fortune. A treasure he planned to leave behind as his legacy was now teetering on the edge of hopelessness. The only light in the house on this storm-ridden night was the presence of his loyal companion, Rusty. But fate had other plans for Walter Grayson. The morning after the storm, Walter woke with a familiar dull ache in his back, the kind that had come with age. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the pale light seeping through the curtains. The house was eerily quiet. Rusty, as always, lay curled up by his feet, warm and still. Walter sighed deeply, rubbing his eyes as the weight of the previous days returned. The ledger with the private key was still nowhere to be found. He felt a deep, gnawing emptiness in his chest. There was no one to turn to for help. Not really. Mark lived across the country in California, and they hadn't spoken much lately. Their relationship had grown distant over the years, and Walter hadn't felt comfortable reaching out. The shame of his situation, his failing memory, and his inability to fix the problem alone gnawed at him. "You've got to be here somewhere," he muttered, shuffling to the kitchen for a cup of coffee. He had gone over every inch of the house. The attic was too small to contain any hidden treasure. The barn too cluttered with old tools and forgotten equipment. His heart was sinking deeper with each passing hour, and the frustration was becoming overwhelming. Rusty stood up and padded silently behind him, his golden coat shining in the morning light. The dog's gaze was fixed on Walter, a look of concern in his eyes. "You know, boy, I think I'm losing my mind," Walter said, half to himself. Rusty whined softly in response, his tail wagging faintly as if trying to reassure his master. Walter smiled weakly and leaned down to scratch behind Rusty's ears. The dog leaned into the touch, his body warm against the old man's legs. "Not a word of this to anyone," Walter whispered. "I've got enough to worry about." But deep down, Walter knew it wasn't just the missing Bitcoin that troubled him. It was the haunting realization that he was growing older and weaker. His mind, once sharp and precise, was slipping. Maybe it was the long years of toil, or maybe it was just his age catching up with him. But his memory had become unreliable, like a map worn out by time. Despite this, Walter refused to give up. The money wasn't just about the wealth. It was his way of ensuring that his son and grandchildren would be taken care of after he was gone. It was the last thing he could offer them. Without it, Walter felt as if he would have nothing to leave behind, nothing that truly mattered. Later that day, Rusty behaved oddly. He'd been following Walter around as usual, but now he was acting distracted, sniffing around more intensely than Walter had ever seen. The dog darted back and forth between rooms, tail straight and ears perked, as if he was trying to tell Walter something important. Walter raised an eyebrow as he watched Rusty's odd behavior. "What's gotten into you, boy?" he muttered, following Rusty as the dog moved swiftly from room to room. Rusty circled the kitchen, sniffing the air, then padded over to the hallway. Walter watched, intrigued but also skeptical. "You think I left it in there?" he asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and desperation. Rusty didn't respond, of course, but his actions were clear. He was trying to lead Walter somewhere. Curious and eager to get this over with, Walter decided to follow. Slowly, painfully, he made his way down the narrow hall to the small room at the end, the one that had always been used for storage. The door creaked open with a groan, and a cloud of dust swirled in the stale air. This was the last place Walter had expected to find anything. But Rusty, undeterred, darted into the room and started sniffing the floorboards with intensity. He scratched at the wooden planks, his paws tapping rhythmically against the surface. Walter knelt down, heart pounding in his chest. What was the dog trying to tell him? Could it be? Rusty let out a small bark, his eyes locked onto the spot where his paws were scraping the floor. Walter's mind raced. Was this it? Could Rusty have found something that Walter had missed? With shaking hands, Walter began to pull at the floorboards. The old wood creaked and groaned under his fingers as he pried them loose, one by one. His heart raced, hope and fear mingling in his chest. And then, at the bottom of the floor space, something shiny caught his eye. There, buried under layers of dust and dirt, was the ledger notebook. Walter froze for a moment, his breath caught in his throat. Was this real? Was it truly what he had been searching for? Rusty sat back, panting, watching Walter as if to say, "You found it, didn't you?" With trembling hands, Walter pulled the notebook free. He could hardly believe it. The binding was old and worn, but there it was, the private key. His fingers brushed the pages, feeling the familiar texture of the notebook, the weight of the secret it held. Tears welled up in Walter's eyes as he looked down at Rusty, his loyal companion who had led him to this moment of salvation. The dog's gaze was steady, unwavering, and full of understanding. "I don't know how you did it, boy," Walter whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But you saved me." Rusty wagged his tail gently, his body still vibrating with excitement. The old man laughed softly through his tears, realizing just how much this dog had come to mean to him. More than just a pet, but a friend, a partner, and a lifeline. Walter's ordeal had finally come to an end. The ledger, the key to his future and the future of his family, had been recovered thanks to Rusty's persistence. But this was not just about the money. It was a reminder of how much Walter had come to rely on his dog. Through the storm of uncertainty, Rusty had been his beacon of hope. Walter sat there on the dusty floor of the storage room, clutching the ledger notebook in trembling hands. A wave of relief surged through him, as though a weight he'd been carrying for days had finally lifted. His heart beat heavily in his chest, and his breaths came in shaky bursts. But this time, they weren't the breaths of a man defeated. They were those of someone brought back from the edge. Rusty sat faithfully at his side, panting quietly, his golden fur slightly dusty from the floorboards. Walter looked at him, his loyal companion, and couldn't help but laugh softly through his tears. "What would I do without you, huh?" he muttered, reaching over to scratch Rusty behind his ears. The dog's tail thumped softly against the floor, and he leaned into Walter's hand. As Walter sat there, holding the ledger as though it were the most precious thing in the world, the enormity of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just about the money. This was about Rusty, about the loyalty of a creature who had loved him so unconditionally that he somehow understood what Walter had needed when even Walter himself had been on the brink of giving up. For the first time in years, Walter thought of Margaret, his late wife who had loved animals almost as much as she had loved him. She'd always said dogs had souls bigger than people's, that they understood things humans couldn't. Back then, he had dismissed it with a chuckle. But now, as he sat next to Rusty, holding on to this rediscovered piece of his legacy, Walter wondered if maybe she had been right all along. Rusty barked softly, pulling Walter from his thoughts. The dog stood and gave a little stretch before nudging the old man's arm. "What?" Walter said with a small smile, wiping his face on his sleeve. "You've done enough, haven't you?" Rusty barked again, more insistent this time, then turned and trotted toward the door. Walter furrowed his brow. The dog turned back to look at him, ears perked, tail wagging, as if to say, "Come on, there's more to do." Walter shook his head but stood up slowly, his joints protesting the movement. "Fine, fine. I'll humor you," he said with a smirk, following Rusty out of the room. Rusty led Walter through the hallway and back into the living room. The fire had died down to a soft glowing ember, casting faint shadows on the walls. Walter was about to collapse back into his chair, exhausted and relieved, when Rusty barked again, louder this time, and turned toward the front door. Walter froze, his heart skipping a beat. He glanced at the frosted window, through which only the pale, lifeless light of the winter morning shone. "What is it, boy?" Walter murmured. The hair on the back of his neck prickled uneasily. Rusty barked once more, pawing at the door. Walter approached cautiously, his brow furrowed. When he pulled open the door, a gust of icy wind hit him square in the face, sending a chill through his bones. Snow covered the landscape as far as the eye could see, shimmering like a sea of diamonds under the morning sun. And then Walter saw it. Something unexpected. Tire tracks. Faint but fresh, they snaked through the snow, leading away from the driveway and out toward the road. Walter's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't had visitors in weeks. Who would have come all the way out here during the storm? Rusty, as if sensing Walter's confusion, bounded outside and followed the tracks. The old man stood in the doorway, clutching the frame for support, watching as Rusty sniffed the trail with purpose. Walter hesitated. "What are you doing, boy?" he called after him, his voice small against the vast frozen expanse. But Rusty didn't stop. He kept moving, following the tracks farther away from the house. The old man swore softly under his breath, but he couldn't just leave the dog out there. Not in this cold. Grabbing his heavy coat and scarf, Walter stepped into his boots and ventured out into the snow, following Rusty's trail. The cold bit at his face and hands, but Walter pushed on. Each step was heavy, the snow deep enough to swallow his boots. Rusty remained a golden beacon ahead of him, his form bounding effortlessly through the drifts as though he was on a mission. Walter followed the tracks for what felt like an eternity, until they led to the edge of his property toward the old barn. The barn had been unused for years. Once, it had been Margaret's favorite place. She had loved its rustic charm and the animals they'd kept when they were younger. But after her passing, Walter couldn't bear to set foot in it. It felt like walking into a graveyard. But now, Rusty stood at the entrance, barking loudly. Walter trudged through the final stretch of snow and stopped just short of the barn. "What is it, Rusty?" he demanded, his breath coming in heavy clouds. The barn door creaked on its hinges as the wind rattled it, like a ghost calling from the other side. Rusty barked again, then turned to look at Walter, his golden eyes sharp and insistent. Swallowing his nerves, Walter reached for the barn door and pulled it open. The interior was dark and smelled faintly of mold and hay. Shafts of pale light broke through cracks in the roof, illuminating the dusty air. Walter stepped inside hesitantly, his boots crunching on the dirt floor. And then he saw it. On the far side of the barn, in a corner where light barely reached, sat an old, forgotten wooden chest. Walter's heart stuttered as memories flooded back. That chest had belonged to Margaret. It had been her place to store keepsakes, letters, photographs, old trinkets from their travels. After she'd passed, Walter hadn't been able to bring himself to go through it. He had locked the barn, shut away the memories, and never looked back. But Rusty stood beside the chest now, his tail wagging slowly as he watched Walter expectantly. The old man approached it with trembling hands, his throat dry. He knelt down and brushed a layer of dust off the top. The lock was rusted but loose. With a sharp tug it gave way, and the chest creaked open. Inside, among the yellowed papers and fading photographs, was a small brown envelope. Walter's hands shook as he picked it up. Scrawled on the front, in Margaret's delicate handwriting, were the words, "For when you need it most." Walter's chest tightened. Slowly, he opened the envelope, and his breath caught in his throat. Inside was a letter, and tucked neatly behind it was a backup copy of the private key he had written down years ago, something Margaret had hidden away, just in case. Tears spilled down Walter's cheeks as he sank to the ground, clutching the envelope to his chest. Rusty sat beside him, pressing his warm body into Walter's side, as if to say, "See? I knew." Rusty hadn't just found the notebook. He had led Walter to something far deeper, something Walter hadn't realized he needed. A final message from his wife. At the edge of despair, Walter had been brought back by his loyal dog, and by a love that transcended time. Walter sat on the cold, dusty barn floor, the small brown envelope trembling in his hands. Rusty sat beside him, watching quietly as his old friend broke down in a way he hadn't in years. Tears traced a path through the dirt on Walter's weathered face, pooling into his beard and catching in the folds of his lined cheeks. He held the letter with reverence, Margaret's handwriting a delicate whisper from the past. For a long moment, he didn't dare open it, afraid of the memories that might spill out. But Rusty nudged him softly with his nose, pulling Walter back to the present. The dog's golden eyes seemed to say, "Go on, you can face this." Taking a steadying breath, Walter unfolded the fragile paper. "My dearest Walt," the letter began. Walter let out a shaky breath. He hadn't heard her voice in so long, yet here it was, alive on the page. "I knew you'd find this when you needed it most. You always were stubborn, my love, but I also know you'd never give up, not when it truly mattered. If you're reading this, then something has brought you here. Maybe it's trouble, maybe it's loss, or maybe you just needed a sign to keep going. Whatever it is, know that I am with you, always." The words blurred through Walter's tears. He could almost see her face as she wrote this, the soft curve of her smile, her hands steady as she poured her love into the ink. "You always worried too much about what you could leave behind. But don't forget that you've already given so much. Love, laughter, and a home filled with warmth. That's what truly matters, Walt. And as for the rest..." Walter's hand clutched the backup copy of the private key that Margaret had stashed away. He let out a sob, half relief, half disbelief. "I knew you'd misplace that ledger one day," the letter continued. "I thought I'd play it safe and keep a copy for you, just in case. Don't get mad at me for meddling. Someone had to look out for you." Walter let out a wet chuckle, despite himself, a sound so unfamiliar after days of despair. "Now, go do what you do best. Take care of our family. You always did have a big heart, even when you pretended otherwise. Give them something to remember you by. But more importantly, Live these days fully, Walt. Don't just survive, live. And don't forget to give Rusty an extra treat for me. He's your angel on 4 paws. Forever yours, Margaret. Walter's shoulders shook as he pressed the letter to his chest, closing his eyes tightly. The grief he'd buried for so long, the years of silence he'd endured without her, the loneliness he thought no one could touch. It all came spilling out like a flood breaking through a dam. But this time, it didn't leave him hollow. It filled him. Rusty stayed close, his warm body pressed against Walter's side, steady as a heartbeat. The dog licked Walter's hand gently, reminding him that he wasn't alone. "Thank you, Margaret," Walter whispered into the stillness of the barn. "Thank you." Over the next few days, the house seemed brighter somehow. The fire burned a little warmer in the hearth. The oppressive weight of the missing notebook and the fear of failure had lifted, replaced with quiet gratitude. Walter didn't waste a minute. After double-checking the private key, he carefully accessed his Bitcoin wallet through his son's old laptop. His heart pounded as the balance appeared on the screen, numbers far larger than he ever could have imagined. The weight of responsibility settled on him once more, but this time it was different. This wasn't about what he had to leave behind. It was about what he chose to give. Rusty watched from his spot by the fire as Walter picked up the phone for the first time in weeks. His hands trembled slightly, but there was determination in his gaze. "Mark?" Walter's voice cracked as he heard his son's familiar, surprised voice on the other end of the line. "Dad, is everything okay?" "Yeah," Walter said softly. "Everything's fine now. Listen, I found something I've been meaning to tell you about." Mark hesitated, confused. "What do you mean?" Walter smiled faintly, glancing at Rusty, who wagged his tail in encouragement. "I'll explain everything soon. Just bring the kids. Come visit, okay? It's been too long." For the first time in years, Mark's voice softened. "Yeah, Dad, we'll come, I promise." Walter hung up, his heart lighter than it had been in years. A week later, Mark and his family pulled up to the farmhouse, their car tires crunching over the frozen snow. Walter stepped onto the porch, bundled in his coat and scarf, Rusty sitting faithfully at his side. When Mark climbed out of the car, he looked hesitant, almost unsure. Walter stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "Welcome home, son." Mark's face softened. He took his father's hand, and before long, Walter found himself enveloped in a hug. For a moment, they simply held on to each other, years of distance melting away in the cold Wyoming air. "Who's this?" Mark's young daughter asked, pointing at Rusty, who wagged his tail excitedly. "That's Rusty," Walter said with pride, crouching down to scratch the dog's ears. "He's the reason you're all here." Rusty barked once as if to agree, and the little girl giggled, rushing over to hug him. The golden dog leaned into her, his tail thumping against the snow, happy to bring warmth where it was most needed. That evening, the farmhouse brimmed with laughter. Mark helped Walter tidy up some of the house while his kids played with Rusty by the fire. Walter couldn't remember the last time the old house felt so alive, filled with voices and joy. Later, as the family sat together for dinner, Mark finally asked about what Walter had found. Walter smiled softly, pulling out the small brown envelope with Margaret's letter. "Your mother always knew how to save me from myself," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "She left this for me, for us." Mark's eyes misted as he read the words his mother had written so many years before. He looked up at his father, gratitude and understanding clear in his expression. "And the Bitcoin?" Mark asked, almost hesitantly. Walter chuckled. "It's there, son. It's safe. And it's for you, for the kids. But your mother was right. The most valuable thing I can leave behind is this." He gestured around the room, at the family gathered together, at the fire crackling in the hearth, at Rusty, lying contentedly by the children's feet. "This," Walter said, his voice steady and warm, "is what truly matters." Rusty lifted his head as if he understood, his eyes meeting Walter's. Walter smiled. "And you, boy, you're the hero of this story." Rusty's tail thumped happily against the floor as Walter leaned back in his chair, surrounded by the family he loved, the laughter he'd missed, and the golden retriever who had saved him in every way possible. Walter's journey had come full circle. Rusty hadn't just led him to the notebook. He'd led him back to his family, back to hope, and back to life. The loyal dog reminded Walter of the most important lesson of all. The treasures that truly matter aren't numbers on a screen, but the love and connection we share. The farmhouse was quiet again. The evening had settled into a peaceful calm, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of Rusty, curled up at Walter's feet. The old man sat back in his armchair, watching the golden glow dance across the room. His family had gone to bed upstairs, their laughter and love still lingering in the air like a comforting embrace. Walter reached down and rested a hand on Rusty's head. The dog stirred slightly but didn't wake, his tail giving one lazy wag. Walter smiled softly. "You did good, boy," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of gratitude. "Better than I ever could have asked for." For so many years, Walter had lived quietly in the shadow of grief, carrying the burdens of solitude and regret. He had believed that his worth was tied to what he could leave behind: a ledger, a private key, a fortune. But in the end, it had been Rusty who showed him the truth. Life was never about the wealth you held. It was about the love you gave. Margaret had known that all along. In her absence, Rusty had been Walter's guide, his silent guardian and unwavering companion. The golden retriever had done more than just find the notebook. He'd brought Walter back to his family, to memories he thought he couldn't face, and to the realization that there was still time to live, to love, and to share what truly mattered. The next morning, as the first light of dawn spilled over the Wyoming plains, Walter stood on the porch, watching Mark and his family prepare to leave. The children hugged Rusty tightly, promising to visit soon, and Mark turned to his father with newfound respect in his eyes. "Thanks for everything, Dad," Mark said quietly. "Mom would be proud of you." Walter's throat tightened, but he nodded. "We owe it to her, and to this guy right here." He patted Rusty's head, and the dog barked happily, as if he understood the praise. As the car disappeared down the snowy driveway, Walter turned to Rusty, the old golden retriever trotting at his side. "Well, boy," Walter said with a small smile, "looks like we've got more time to enjoy this life after all." Rusty barked softly, his tail wagging as he followed Walter back into the house. For the first time in years, the old man felt whole. Walter's story is a reminder to all of us. Life's greatest treasures aren't found in wealth or possessions, but in the loyalty of a companion, the love of a family, and the memories that connect us across time. Sometimes it takes a loyal friend, one with paws and a wagging tail, to lead us back to what truly matters.